With the conclusion of YCS Indianapolis the past weekend, we now have a better idea of what the best decks are going to be post Age of Overlord. So if you guys are enjoying this type of content, then be sure to let me know by leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing. But with all that being said, let's just hop straight into the video. So first, just going over the tiers themselves. BIF stands for best deck in the format. Strong tier 1, these are the decks that have the potential to win big tournaments and are very competitive alongside the best deck of the format. The best deck of the format, in my opinion, isn't necessarily miles ahead of the strong tier 1 decks, so any deck in this tier I think has the potential to do very well at a big tournament. Weak tier 1, these are the decks that I think have the possibility of doing well but either need a skilled pilot or they need a lot of things to go right and go their way during the tournament. Tier 2, so these are the decks I think are still okay. They can maybe do well if the player gets lucky, but I think there are better choices out there in the weak tier 1 and strong tier 1 sections. And then finally, questionable. These are the decks that I personally don't think you should be playing this format because they just aren't that good. And of course, like with all other tier list videos, this is just my opinion and my opinion. We only have the YCS Indianapolis results to go off of. With all that being said, let's just hop straight into the video. So the first one is going to be Branded Despia. I think Branded Despia, with its lack of representation lately, is probably going to end up in like top of tier 2 in my opinion. I think it's still an okay deck for the most part, but I feel like there are just a lot of other decks that slowly start to outclass it now. And while I do think it's a very strong deck still, it can still put up things like the Gimmick Puppet Lock if they choose to. I just feel like the deck's vulnerabilities to like Ash Blossom and Infinite Impermanence at times can make it difficult for it to compete with some of the decks out there. I will say, however, though, since they can play cards like Bystials, they might have some saving grace that might put them in weak tier 1. But at the end of the day, at least from representation wise, I do feel like Branded Despia is probably best suited to be put in the tier 2 category, at least for now. Next up is Unchained. So Unchained I think is definitely a strong tier 1 contender still. Even though it didn't have the greatest representation at the YCS, I still feel like this deck is very strong. Nothing's really changed about it. A lot of other decks got new support, but Unchained is still an incredibly powerful deck with some of the boards it can put up. Plus, its engine is just very resilient and able to play through boards that decks like Rescue Ace can put up for the most part. So I would say that Unchained is definitely still a very strong pick and definitely still win events. Next up is TG. So the only reason I'm putting this here is because it is a new deck to come out of Age of Overlord, and I did want to focus on what I personally felt would be the 20 most relevant and talked about decks. I will say that TG is probably a questionable pick. I don't think this is a very good deck. There are just better combo decks out there, even from seeing some of the stuff this deck can do. Like, if you just look at the other combo decks on this tier list, I don't see why you'd ever choose to play this deck over another one of these decks. It doesn't do anything particularly better than those combo decks, and in general is probably just worse. So if you are looking for a combo deck to play, I would not recommend TG. Unless I'm missing something very big, I don't think this deck is going to do very well just because of how fragile it seems, and plus how many quote-unquote bricks it has to play with all like the old TG cards. Next up is Sprite and Sprite variants. So a couple of Sprites did top Indianapolis, although their run ended in top 32. I still feel like the Sprite deck is still fairly strong. I think the problem with Sprite is that it just doesn't really do anything super unfairly anymore. Like, it has a very good resource engine and has the potential to go into cards like Ibli to lock out your opponents potentially, but there are other decks that are probably just better that can do that. And Sprite's boards themselves feels like you can just play through them with all the powerful extenders that a lot of these other decks have. So I'm probably just gonna have to put Sprite in like tier 2. Definitely still an okay deck and can be flexible with the possibility of playing cards like Runic and Live Twin in it, but at the end of the day, I don't think Sprite is really going to do super well this format. It might see a few tops here or there, but aside from that, I feel like it's probably just going to stay as a tier 2 deck. Next up is Pearly. Pearly, without a doubt, is a strong tier 1 deck. It was the second most represented deck at the top cut of YCS Indianapolis, I think for good reason. Pearly, just like Unchained, is still incredibly strong, and while other decks got new support, I just feel like Pearly is still just as good as it was before Age of Overlord. Pearly still has that win condition in towers that a lot of decks just have to respect. It's a deck that commands respect in your side deck. You do have to consider playing cards like Xyz's Encore, Herald of the Abyss with Thrust, for example, almost exclusively for this deck. And at that point, I think just goes to show how strong of a deck this can be. Next up is Sword Soul. So although Sword Soul didn't make the top cut, there was a Sword Soul player that had been doing pretty well at the tournament so far. But at the end of the day, I feel like Sword Soul is probably just going to end up in the tier 2 slot, just like these other decks like Sprite and Branded Despia. It's a solid deck, and it still has some pretty nice options when going first. Has some opportunities to go second as well. Generally, Sword Soul is a pretty safe choice into pretty much any format out there. So if you still aren't really too sure what you want to go with, Sword Soul is flexible and adaptable enough to be able to be played in almost every format out there. So that's just an extra note about Sword Soul. Next up is Tier Elements, also a strong tier 1 deck in my opinion. It did see a fair amount of representation in Top Cut. Tier Elements engine is just so strong, both going first and going second. Going first, it's super snowbally. As soon as the first cards start getting milled to the graveyard, that's when things start to really get out of control. Usually a single hand trap isn't enough to stop them. You're going to need multiple, or you're just going to need to suck it up and try to play through their boards that they set up. Not to mention, when going second, their engine is one of the best at breaking boards alone, just because there's so many cards that you feel like you have to stop before they start milling, because once they start milling, they can start chain blocking stuff, and the snowballing just sort of continues from there. It makes it very difficult for you to actually be able to stop them, no matter how much interruption you might have on your board. So definitely a very solid tier 1 pick, and I definitely think it's going to be one of the front runners for this next format. Next up is Mannadium. So Mannadium did get top 4 and top 16 at YCS Indianapolis, and my personal bias aside, I do think this is a very strong deck, especially with the new support it's got. It's definitely the best combo deck of the format in my opinion, at the very least. It does have a very crippling weakness to Droll and Lockbird, which is something to note, but aside from that, it can pretty much play through any hand traps going first, and going second, it has a solid chance to be able to break the other boards going second. Now, that being said, however, I will say that in order to do super well with Mannadium, you need to be quite experienced with its deck. And for that reason, I'm going to put it in weak tier 1. I think objectively, it's a very good deck and definitely has the potential to win. This is a deck that, of course, you would prefer to go first with, and it definitely is not as great as some of the other decks out there as at going second. But aside from that and its weakness to Droll, it's definitely one of the strongest decks in the format, and definitely one I think that commands respect. So I'm going to end up putting it in the weak tier 1 for now. Next up is Chimera. So Chimera is probably my definition of weak tier 1. It's a pretty solid deck. It's very flexible. You can play a lot of non-engine. You can adapt your non-engine and adapt your build to whatever the format needs it to be. And it also has some very unfair things that it can do with the new Baphomet fusion. You're able to send cards like the End of Anubis to the graveyard, and then from there be able to bring it back. And that can be incredibly powerful just to shut out decks like Tier Elements and Unchained. So it should have a decent matchup against those other Tier 1 decks. Going first, it's very snowbally as well. Going second, you have a couple of different options. With your high amount of non-engine, you're very likely to have been able to stop your opponent, meaning you should be able to push your plays through most of the time. So I think that it's a solid tier 1 choice. It is on the weaker end in my opinion, because there is some vulnerability to Ash Blossom and Infinite Impermanence like Branded Despia, but I think it does have a little bit of an edge over Branded Despia because it has more pushes than just Branded Fusion. Next up is Pendulum. So specifically the Zark cards from Age of Overlord are the ones I wanted to talk about. I think that these cards have a lot of potential and they can be pretty solid, but like I mentioned with TG, you wouldn't really want to play like Pendulum this format. I think there's just too many vulnerabilities, and it has extra vulnerabilities to cards like Anti-Spell randomly, and D-Barrier, of course. Like, you lose to multiple of these big blowouts that people are playing in their side decks, which I should have mentioned, I guess, for when I was talking about Mannadium. Mannadium can beat cards like D-Barrier and sometimes Anti-Spell, whereas Pendulum cannot. And that's sort of one thing that Pendulum really has a big weakness of. Going second is going to be incredibly difficult, especially post-siding. So I think that while these cards have a lot of potential, probably more than the TG cards, I still don't think it's going to be a very good choice for this next format. Next up is Exosister. So Exosister did surprisingly, in my opinion, get top 8 at YCS Indianapolis. I feel like this deck is probably still just a tier 2 deck. It has some pretty good matchups like into Tierlist, for example, and it probably has okay matchups into other meta decks across the board since it does have access to cards like Dimension Shifter. But aside from that, that's sort of where its like strong points end in my opinion. It's just very linear and very predictable on how to actually stop their plays, and going second can be a big problem for them if they don't have non-engine to back it up. It's pretty hard for their engine inherently to actually be able to go second and play through boards like some of the other decks in the format. So I think that for that reason, Exorbitant probably just has to stay as a tier 2 deck in my opinion. Yeah, it has potential to absolutely blow out some of these top decks out there with some of the cards they can play like Shifter. But aside from that, their engine is just pretty weak going second, and it's a deck that probably needs to rely a lot on either drawing non-engine or winning the dice roll and going first. Next up is Dragon Link. I think Dragon Link is in a decent spot at the moment. I will put them at like the middle of weak tier 1. I think they have a lot of potential because the Bystials, of course, hit quite a few of the meta matchups out there like Tierlist and Vanadium. Not to mention against a deck like Rescue Ace, you do have quite a few extenders that could potentially help you push through their board. Dragon Link is a deck that has the potential to actually break through boards like that. Not to mention Dragon Link has the option to be a very flexible deck and end on different end boards for each matchup. Also, not really losing to big blowouts like Dimensional Barrier that people are playing in their side deck. So I think for that reason, it has quite a bit going for it. I'd say it's like at the top of weak tier 1, maybe bottom of strong tier 1. The only reason I'm reluctant to put it a little bit higher is because of its lack of representation in the top cut overall. I do feel like while this deck is good, there are a few inherent flaws with this deck that the other decks just have an edge over it in. So for that reason, I'm gonna just leave it in the weak tier 1 for now. Next up is Cyber's decks. So I put Salamangreat here as the face of it, but when I say Cyber's decks, I'm referring to decks like Marine Cess, Mathmeg, and Salamangreat. I feel like they all sort of fall into the same category of one card Cyber's decks that can play a lot of non-engine and can sometimes play nasty floodgates like Rivalry or Gozen. Since a card like Nibiru has kind of been picking up in popularity lately, at least at the YCS, I feel like that is sort of like a big boon to these decks. Nibiru is usually a card that heavily punishes these Cybertest decks because they don't really have good ways to play around it. I think that's a big weakness of these decks that can't be ignored. So I think for that reason, based on the way the meta trends are going and the fact that these decks also can have problems when going second when they don't draw non-engine, ultimately make me put it in at the bottom of tier 2. Next up is Infernoble Knight. So Infernoble Knight, I think, is a little bit better than Pendulum and TG. It is a little bit more resilient, but I wouldn't say it's as good as Vanadium. So I'm going to put it in the tier 2 category. It is still a scary combo deck that should be respected. But at the end of the day, I feel like it's sort of just like Vanadium when going first. It puts up a board that you can't really break, that doesn't lose to Dark Ruler. But going second, I feel like it has just a few too little pushes compared to a deck like Vanadium. Next up is Vanquish Soul. So Vanquish Soul, personally, I've always felt that this deck is not that good. Yes, it did get one top 32 at YCS Indianapolis, but even now with Jiaolong and the new trap card, I still feel like this deck has the same issues it did before. It's a deck that sort of needs non-engine to be able to do super well, even when going first, because the problem with their going first boards is it just feels like a lot of decks can play through them even with just engine, unless they have a powerful non-engine card like There Can Be Only One. So while it does have a couple of things going for it, it can be quite snowbally with a card like Jiaolong. I do feel like the fact that it is very reliant on Raisin, and the fact that their plays are somewhat linear when they're going first and going second, I just feel like this is a deck that probably needs a very good pilot to do super well with, or they're going to need to be able to abuse and see those powerful non-engine cards like Dimension Shifter and There Can Be Only One. For that reason, I'm going to put it at like the bottom of weak tier 1 and the top of tier 2. I know if I put this in tier 2, I'm probably going to get a lot of comments about it, but in my personal opinion, I think it's a tier 2 deck, but I would say objectively, it's probably like a weak tier 1 deck. Next up is Dark World. So Dark World, a lot of people have been talking about it because of Ken and Jen. They're saying it makes the deck a lot better, and while I do agree it makes Dark World a lot better, I still think the deck has the same inherent problems it always had before. It loses the Shifter, loses the Droll. Going second, if your opponent starts cutting off your drawing choke points like Dugaras, it can be incredibly hard for you to get going. Now, that being said, however, it is sort of in a similar boat as Vanadium, where it's like you better have Droll or Shifter, because if you don't, this deck is going to pop off going first. You're probably going to lose the game, And going second, it does have the potential to actually push through a lot of the boards out there with just engine because of how snowbally the deck cards can be once you get going. I personally do feel like Dark World is in a similar boat as Vanadium. It's sort of like you have to see those big blowout cards to stop it. Otherwise, it's going to break through your entire board and you're probably going to get OTK'd that turn. So I'm going to put it at like the top of tier 2. I think it's a pretty strong deck overall. And I think that it's a deck that you should probably still respect in your side decking. So consider playing cards like Droll against it. Next up is Labyrinth. I think Labyrinth's also in a decent spot. It's always just been a solid deck that can be very easily adapted to whatever the meta calls for. It has a solid Rescue Ace matchup, I think, considering the Rescue Ace cards don't actually do too much to the Labyrinth engine themselves, and Labyrinth has the potential to slowly outgrind the Rescue Ace player as long as the game goes on and on. So I'm gonna say that since Labyrinth has a good matchup into these meta decks out there, at the end of the day, it is a trap deck. It does have that inherent weakness of going second that some of these other meta decks just don't have. So I feel like that's sort of the big weakness that's holding it back from being a strong tier 1 deck. I'm gonna put it in the weak tier 1 for now. It's just a solid pick overall, and it has good matchups across the board. Next up is Sinful Spoils Rescue Ace. So this was the most represented deck at YCS Indianapolis Top Cut, and it did end up winning the event. So I'd say that at least for now, Sinful Spoils Rescue Ace is the best deck of the format. Although when I say that, I don't mean it's like miles ahead of these like other decks out there. I would say it's fairly close even to everything like weak tier 1 and above. But the only reason I'm putting in the best deck of the format is based on those results from YCS Indianapolis. It has a great resource game. It has a lot of potential when going first, setting up a variety of different boards like the Neo Tempest Terahertz, or going for IP Masquerena into SP Little Knight. They're all different options that you can go into. Going second, as you've seen in the featured matches, it can do so as well. So I wouldn't say this deck is insane or broken by any means, but it's definitely a slightly cut above a lot of the other decks on this list here. So I would say until the format drastically changes, Rescue Ace Sinful Spoils is probably just going to be the best deck out there. Next up is Rika Sun Avalon. So Rika Sun Avalon, I think, is also a deck that's similar to Vanadium. So it's a big combo deck that demands respect. Like going first, if they go off uninterrupted, you're probably not going to be able to stop them. But then the problem with this deck is that going second, it can be pretty hard for them to break through boards with just engine. They're going to need those powerful non-engine cards in order for them to actually push through a board. So I think that similar to Vanadium, it has those problems with going second, similar to Infernoble Knights and these other combo decks. So I'm gonna have to put it in like weak tier 1 in my opinion, probably near the middle of it. It's still an incredibly strong deck, particularly because people also still for some reason don't know how to properly stop this deck. So I think that that's sort of one thing Rika has going for it. Just people aren't too familiar with it, and it's still a very snowbally combo deck that can do quite a few things unfairly. Finally, Fluonderies. I think Fluonderies is always in an okay spot in every format out there. It doesn't get blown out by cards like Dimension Shifter that are running around all the time, and it can play unfair cards like Dimension Shifter and Harpy's Featherstorm. So I think it's just going to go in the weak tier 1. It definitely has good matchups across the board. Cards like Shifter and Featherstorm are just absolutely insane, and there's nothing you can really do about them should they resolve. If it starts losing to itself because of things like consistency, that's sort of one thing I think it has that's holding it back from being like a strong tier 1 deck. But at the end of the day, if your plays can't get started, then it doesn't really matter how good the deck can be. So that's gonna do it for this tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. Remember, at the end of the day, this is just my opinion and my opinion only. So if you disagree, then let me know in the comment section below. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.